rehabmypatient.com has had a massive update. 1,000 strength and conditioning exercises have been added to the library for you to prescribe to your patients. Pictures, videos, fully customizable text, deliverable by email and WhatsApp. What is not to love? Go to rehabmypatient.com/physio matters for a 3-month free trial on us.
Hi everybody, thank you very much for tuning in to Chewing It Over. I've got Orla O'Doherty with me today and I'm really pleased to be talking with her. So Orla, why is it so hard to get patients to follow our advice?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? I wish there was a simple answer, but I think one of the main reasons that we struggle to get patients to follow our advice is that we know our perspective, we know the rationale behind the advice that we're giving, we know why it's so important, we know the benefits of it. And I think in trying to communicate that to patients, we get very much into this mode of persuading, convincing, trying to fix it for them, always do it for them if we could, I'm sure we would. But actually, we often fail to see things from the patient's perspective. I think a lot of us do that to some extent, but we don't necessarily understand from the patient's side of things what it means for them to follow our advice or what things might be getting in the way. And I think that if we can get to a point where we're understanding that more, then patients will be more likely to follow our advice. That might be because we have been able to modify it to suit them better, or it might be because we've had a better, open, more honest conversation about where each of us stands, and we can come to a compromise and agreement about what can be done, what needs to be done.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you. And I think it gives us a little clue to what you might be talking about at Therapy Live. So before we get on to that, could you maybe tell our listeners and some of our viewers a little bit about you and your background and sort of how you've ended up here, really?
Sure. So I started out my career as a physio. I specialised primarily in MSK and worked at a few different trusts and did a little bit of private practice as well. And I think over the years, I just became increasingly frustrated at developing and gaining all this expertise and sharing it with patients, giving them this advice to help them get better and feel better. And so often they wouldn't follow it, or they'd follow it in part, but not completely. And yeah, it was a growing frustration. And through conversations with colleagues, I realised happily that I wasn't alone. And that a lot of people were experiencing this. So I became more and more interested in why this might be, what I might be able to do to try and persuade or convince patients to do what they were being advised to do. Started doing a lot of reading around the area and became more and more interested in it. I remember quite clearly coming across a book. It was actually a gift from a physio leaving do, called Happiness by Design by Paul Dolan. And that was a book that I read that kind of made everything just click. And I realized for the first time that actually this field of behavioral science was a thing that people studied. And there was a lot of evidence in that field that could be useful to us as clinicians to help us help our patients. So I became more and more interested in that area and ended up doing a master's in behaviour change. I was such a geek about the whole thing. And yeah, I ended up leaving clinical practice about 3 years ago or so, and did a little bit of service management in a service that actually specialised in supporting self-management and behaviour change. And then about a year ago, moved on to working at UCL Partners, which is an academic health science network in London. And I work there. Actually, I have a bit of a random job title. I'm an education fellow, which doesn't really describe what I do at all. But the role of UCL Partners is to work with various stakeholders to solve some of the biggest health challenges that our community is facing through research and innovation. So that's where I am at the moment.
Such an exciting journey, and I get a really nice, because I think you've probably got a really good understanding from your clinical work as well about maybe what those challenges look like on the front line a little bit. So that, I mean, that's really good, and to have done masters in it, I think it's so rare, isn't it, in the world of physio? So we're very lucky that you're coming to share some of your knowledge and expertise with us. So I guess that brings me on to your title. So those of you who have seen the Therapy Live agenda might have seen that Orla's title is what Sherlock Holmes can teach us about getting our patients to follow our advice. So I was most intrigued when I first saw this. So can you maybe give us a little explanation about how you came up with it and how Sherlock Holmes might relate to physio?
Well, I don't know if this says more about my obsession with crime dramas and novels than anything else, but there were so many times during my studies that I read something or heard something and thought, God, I wish I'd known that when I was studying physio or practicing physio. It would have been so helpful. And I think one of the main ones that stood out to me was this correlation between the world of behavioral science and trying to change people's behavior, whether that's in physiotherapy or transport behaviors or climate behaviors, and the world of the detective and criminal justice. And there was this correlation between means, motive, and opportunity, which I'd heard of before because I, watched CSI like most people and all the others. And this link between that and the COM-B model, which is capability, which is the equivalent of means, and opportunity and motivation. And it was just one of those kind of aha moments, like, okay, this makes sense. And what's nice about means, motive, opportunity, or COM-B is that it is just one model that unifies all theories of behavior change, because behavioral science is a massive field. There are at least 83 theories of behavior change that we could potentially pick from to try and start influencing our patients' behavior, and it's impossible. So what's really nice about the COM-B model is it pulls that all together and simplifies all of it so that we can start to have a practical tool to use to help us in trying to influence what our patients do.
That sounds great. Could you maybe give us a little baby example of how you might use that? So maybe like a kind of idiot's guide for putting that into practice. And maybe people can have a little experiment before we hear you on Therapy Live, and then you can improve our skills later in June.
Yeah, definitely. So COM-B is kind of the overarching model. There are more probably practical detailed tools that I will introduce at the talk. But as I said, COM-B stands for, the C is capability. So that's saying that for anybody to be able to do anything, they need to have the capability to be able to do it. So the skills, both physical and psychologically, to be able to do it. The O stands for opportunity. That means that to be able to do a behavior, the person needs to have social opportunity. So that means things like having permission to do it, but also physical opportunity. So they need to have the time, the resources, the environment that allows them to do it. And then lastly, and probably most importantly, they need to have motivation to do it. So that might be kind of the reflective motivation. So making a decision that, yes, I really want to do this. I need to do it, but also the automatic motivation. So things like, prompts or triggers you might see in your environment that remind you to do it. And if we have all three of those, then we can, in theory, perform a behavior. But if one of those is missing, then it will be difficult for us to do it. So what I reflect for myself, and I think a lot of clinicians do, is that we are really, really good at making sure that our patients have the capability to do what we ask them to do. So we will do a demonstration of an exercise, we'll get them to practice it with us, make sure that they're doing it correctly, make sure that they've got enough stamina, strength to do it. And so we're really good at that. And I think we're usually, not always, fairly good at making sure that our patient is motivated, or at least trying to persuade them to be motivated. explaining this is really important because XYZ, if you want to get better, then we need to do this exercise, once a day, 3 times a day, whatever it may be. What we're not so good at is checking that opportunity box. So, for example, I, before moving into this job, and after working in MSK, I worked briefly in urogynecology, so specialised in treating people who had problems with continence or prolapse or pelvic pain. So oftentimes I would be giving patients a prescription to do pelvic floor exercises, which I would need to advise them to do 3 times a day. But that is easier said than done, right? What I would find is that I would explain the exercises, explain that they take, 2 or 3 minutes only, depending on your stamina. And people would think, okay, great, easy. I know how to do it. I know why I need to do it. And it doesn't take long, that's fine. Invariably, they would come back and they haven't done it. And what I learned was that actually asking somebody to do something 3 times a day is quite difficult, because for most people, just remembering to do that is going to be difficult. We all have busy lives. So remembering something new 3 times a day is very, very tough. So what I started to do was to preempt that and explain that, yes, you know how to do it. Brilliant. You're motivated. You know why you need to do it. Yes, it only takes a few minutes to do each time, but remembering to do anything 3 times a day is easier said than done. So what you might want to think about is getting yourself the Squeezy app, for example, which has a reminder tool on it, or just setting yourself an alarm. Now, that's not to say that that's a guarantee for them to be able to get it done, because forgetting isn't always the barrier, and it's not always the only barrier. But it was definitely one with that type of patient, that particular type of exercise, where I knew I was better off preempting that I needed to make sure they had the opportunity and remember to do it.
So it actually sounds then like sometimes the advice I guess we start to give of being like, oh, you could do your heel raises every time you make a cup of tea in the day, is actually a lot more useful advice than perhaps we give it credit for, in that kind of physical and memory prompt, it kind of gives them that opportunity to do that activity. And maybe we undersell that a little bit.
Yeah, well, habit, especially with something that you want them to do frequently and or regularly, habit is a surefire way to help them do that. I think what's often useful is we can get into the habit of recommending they do it a certain way. Like I said, get the Squeezy app, but actually what's usually more useful is to prompt them to think of their own reminder, because we could suggest, oh, do it while you make a cup of tea, and then they say, oh, but I don't really drink tea. And then you're like, okay, yes, you know what I mean, but actually if you say to them, it can be quite difficult to remember or squeeze this in, you might want to think about doing it while you do something else that doesn't take much concentration, or just get them to start thinking of it. Generally speaking, if the idea comes from them, they will be a lot more likely to do it.
Yeah, and that's always the thing. And I think this kind of the term like motivational interviewing, it gets bandied about more and more in physio now, and probably one of those things that someone like you is maybe a lot better at than the general physio. Is there any kind of, I guess, starting points that you could maybe give a physio to prompt themselves about rather than to prompt the patient about?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, because when I started getting interested in this area, I was very much thinking, I want to know how to change patient behaviour, and then realised more and more, actually, I need to learn how to change clinician behaviour so that they can help their patients change their behaviour. It all becomes a bit meta. But yes, I've forgotten the question.
I say, is there anything that physios or any other clinician really can do, maybe either prior to a consultation or during a consultation, that can just, I guess, prompt their memory to kind of go more on this motivational interviewing, patient choice-led method rather than a recommendation?
Yes. So yeah, definitely. I actually tutor on a program to teach clinicians about motivational interviewing, and I think probably the the most useful skill for motivational interviewing that I would say to have in mind is the ORS skill, which is O for open questions, so asking open questions, so that the patient has a chance to really reveal to you what is behind their thinking or how they're feeling or why they've been doing or not doing something. The A then stands for affirmation, so that's affirming what they've said. It's helping you to demonstrate empathy, that you're not judging their response, but that you actually understand where they're coming from. The R then stands for reflection. So by reflecting all that you've understood, you can do two things. You can check in that you are correct, and they can either say, yes, that's right, or they can correct you. But also you're demonstrating again that you really have heard them. And then the S, if you're having a longer consultation, then summarizing just all the things that you've agreed. I think if you ask those open questions and reflect back that you've heard, you have that much more kind of two-way conversation, rather than it being very didactic and you kind of lecturing the patient about what they need to do. And also by asking those open questions, you're really finding out what's important to the patient. So we're good at knowing what's important for them, but finding out what's important to them. And by getting that balance, I think we can get to a point where they're much more likely to do what we're saying that they should be doing to get better.
Yeah, that's great. And it's really interesting, isn't it? And it's nice to have that framework. We love pathways, don't we, as clinicians, and frameworks, and it kind of helps us with that. And yeah, just maybe give you something to go through. I guess one question I had is, we're ever time pressured, aren't we? And more time pressured. I guess something has to go if we're adding extra things in. Is there something that you found that perhaps we really think now, I guess historically clinicians have thought is really important that they must do, but actually in your experience, it's maybe not as important as we set our hearts on?
Well, I wonder if anything really needs to go per se, because once you are, like with any skill, once you're actually practiced at motivational interviewing or approaching a consultation through that kind of behavioral insights lens, actually it just becomes part of it. So it's not a new skill to add on to the beginning, middle, or end. It's actually a way of carrying out your existing consultation. And actually, if you can get to a point where it actually makes things shorter and quicker. And I had a really good example of this. For my dissertation, I was interviewing clinicians who had attended the motivational interviewing training that I now tutor on, and talking to them about one particular skill, which was agenda setting. And a lot of clinicians, especially initially, are reluctant to set an agenda at the outset of an appointment, because that, can of worms that we fear just opening up, that's what we're really scared of. And all this stuff coming out that either we don't know the answer to, or it's not in our remit, or we don't have time for today. And so we just
ignore it. Yeah.
No, I don't want to know. Let's just concentrate on the one thing. But actually what one of the clinicians fed back, and I think this was a GP actually, so they have even less time, I think, than most physios. So I take this to be a genuine reflection of his experience. He said actually once he got into the role of agenda setting, he realized how much time it saved him. You invest this kind of time at the beginning to set the agenda, but in doing that you are then so clear, and you kind of almost set this contract with the patient for the session, where you can really be clear about what you can deal with today and what you need to deal with another time, and when that might be, what you can't deal with because it's not within your scope. And by doing that, you actually focus the patient in on what's reasonable and realistic. So it's things like that. When you get into the habit and practice of doing it, it actually makes things quicker. So I hope people don't have to drop anything ultimately, and that they can still feel like they're doing everything that they need to do as part of their consultation.
But the agenda thing sounds like gold dust. And as someone who used to work a bit in education, it makes lots of sense. We always used to set an objective at the start of the lesson and say, this is what we're going to cover. And this is what we're going to do it. So there was an expectation from students, and they weren't just sat there going, well, what are they going to do next, in sort of suspense the whole time. So I think we don't want to give any more of your secrets away, because your Therapy Live talk sounds so exciting. So before we wrap up, could you maybe give people an idea of like where they can maybe follow you on social media, or other courses that you run that they can go and have a look at, anything like that, so they can sort of get prepared?
Sure. So I'm mainly just on Instagram, because I don't have time to focus on any more than one thing at a time. But you can find me, I'm the clinic coach on Instagram, at the clinic coach, I think. I am also on LinkedIn as Orla O'Doherty. You can find me on there, contact me on there. The motivational interviewing training that I am part of at the Whittington Trust, which is called ADP. Anybody, if they happen to work in Haringey or Islington, can come along to that, but I'm afraid it's limited to that at the moment. But what I'm doing very soon, I'm very excited about, is launching some educational programs in how to use behavioural insights to help with clinical practice. So I'll be sharing that very, very soon.
Excellent. So hot off the press, if you're listening before you come to Therapy Live. Thank you very much, Orla, for your time. I'd say if you're listening and you found this really interesting, I certainly have, and definitely will be tuning in between all the talks. I don't quite know how I'm going to manage to get to them all at the same time, but that's what recordings are for. So please do buy your tickets. There is a limited number, and time is getting ticking on and getting closer to Therapy Live. So don't miss out and don't be disappointed. It comes around sort of once a year, and it really is a fantastic day. You can catch Orla among lots of other fantastic speakers that are covering a huge variety of clinical practice, right from your kind of early career up to advanced practice. Reach out to us on the socials if you have any questions. But for the meantime, I will let Orla leave us. She's given us quite enough of her time. And just thank you very, very much. And we look forward to seeing you very soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Here at Physio Matters, we think physio matters. Join as a premium member now and access over 500 videos, get free tickets to shows and upgrades included. Access at home, work or on a unicycle to take your knowledge to the moon. Physio-matters.com, more content than you can fit into a gym.